Perhaps most significantly, the coup ushered in by the CIA that brought Castillo Armas to power ushered in a long, drawn out, extremely violent civil war in Guatemala that, depending on how scholars count it, lasted for about 36 years or so. So I've numbered it 1961 to 1996, but some of the beginnings of that civil war were before 1961. Some of the residue of that civil war continues even today. So a very horrible and dark period in Guatemala's history in many ways, but one that's important to understand something about, I think. The men over here on the right-hand side of the screen, and I know you can't see the guy on the bottom. I apologize for that design error. But these were some of the military dictators of this period of civil war, beginning with Manuel Ydígoras Fuentes. He took power after Castillo Armas was assassinated in 1957. 1963, a coup was led against him. Because of that problem of not having any kind of regular succession of the leader, the military decided it would be a good idea to have a civilian in power. So that was Julio Cesar Méndez Montenegro. He was actually an associate of Arévalos, and he was in power from 1966 to 1970. I say it that way because there wasn't really a democratic election. The military made the decision about who they would allow to be on the ballot and how they would message that. And so ballots, for all intents and purposes, were just sort of pretenses, shows at making it seem that there was some semblance of democracy going on. While Méndez Montenegro was in power, the military was actually running the show. He was a civilian face of the administration, but not really much else. In 1970, Carlos Arana Osorio took the helm. He was known as the Butcher for a horrible massacre that he led in the town of Zacapa in 1968. At that point, he was running a counterinsurgency that was supported by the United States. They had provided training and weapons to go after leftist militants, guerrillas, and Arana Osorio really heightened the civil war. So again, with his tenure as a military officer prior to his tenure as president, deaths really went on the rise. Paramilitary death squads multiplied. There were many of these that were sponsored and supported by the state. Some of their names included things like La Mano Blanca, the white hand, Ojo por Ojo, an eye for an eye. And again, their goal was to root out what they saw as a communist threat from the guerrillas that were threatening to and trying to unseat these very repressive military regimes. Romeo Lucas Garcia, who you can't see there, was in power from 1978 to 1982, and you can tell I've skipped a few of the leaders, but the overall message and the trajectory is kind of the same. Very little impunity for massive amounts of state violence against the people of Guatemala. Who were they fighting against? Well, among these groups were the Fuerzas Armadas Rebeldes, or the FAR. This was an openly Marxist guerrilla group that was challenging the authority of the state in the 1960s and 70s. Also, there was another group called the MR-13 that was openly Marxist that fielded guerrillas as well. The image of the Guatemalan Workers' Party, or the Partido Guatemalteco de Trabajo, that's the older Communist Party that was more of an institutional political party, had very little to do actually with the guerrilla movements, although it still existed in Guatemala. So also trying to emphasize there were many different fractious political parties, despite the heavy-handed power of the military during the Civil War era. And in the middle of all of this, campesinos in the fields in rural Guatemala, these Mayans that we've talked about, that many of whom benefited from agrarian reform, from the constitutional reforms of 1945, from the labor laws, they found themselves caught in the middle of this. Some of them were just slaughtered, as in the case that I mentioned in which Arana Osorio led the counterinsurgency in the countryside. That only increased in the 1980s. This image here, the people that were sought for justice, we should bring them to justice, these were members of what became known as that MR13 group that I mentioned a second ago. The man you see most of here is Efrain Rios Montt. He took power in 1982, was only in power for about 18 months, but during his tenure in office, the death rate just spiked. There were more and more disappearances. His administration presided over a horrific genocide of Mayan peoples, various sites, especially in northern and eastern Guatemala. So not only were people like Rios Montt trying to defend against communism, but they saw indigenous people as fomenting and harboring communists as well. So they believed that these kinds of casualties were more or less just collateral damage in their efforts to rid Guatemala of this communist presence. And of course, in the United States, Ronald Reagan reinvigorated the Cold War during his administration in the 1980s. In the center there, you can see him at a meeting with Efrain Rios Montt in 1982. Reagan infamously, famously, however you want to look at it, supported the Rios Montt regime that most international observers see as having been responsible for genocide against the Mayans. The other man that's pictured here, excuse me, so the other man that's pictured here is Otto Perez Molina. He's here in this photograph in the early 80s. Actually, I think that's the 90s, as one of the head officers of the Guatemalan military. He later became president of Guatemala. Here he is in 2015. That's a purposely conspicuous photo because the other side, famously not last year, 2 years ago now in 2015, protests via Twitter began with the hashtag Renuncia Ya that forced him to step down from office. So just to emphasize a couple of things by bringing up Perez Molina, he was one of the orchestrators of genocide under Rios Montt, yet he was able to gain the presidency in the 2010s, so within the last few years. He was removed from power not because of his implications of having participated in the genocide, but because of the corruption of his administration. And that's been an ongoing problem for Guatemalan administrations from 2000 forward, is a horrible plague of corruption, of being connected to narcos, of drug dealing, of course, of bribery, of money laundering, of all these sorts of horrific things that they're using the government for. He was actually forced from power, though, through a Twitter campaign. And if you click on this image, if you get the slides, that will take you to an episode of Radio Ambulante that I've also assigned if you get the chance for this section of the unit. That tells that story of how he was forced from power. So all of this is to say that Guatemala is still reeling from the legacy of these civil wars. Of course, culture is very strong. Mayan weaving, Mayan culinary traditions. The landscapes of Guatemala are breathtaking and wonderful, and people love to go there. But it's all kind of alongside this horrible story of ethnic strife and civil war that we've just outlined. This last slide shows the efforts of the Guatemalan Truth Commission. There were actually two Truth Commissions, one that was sponsored by the UN. That's the one that you can see right here, the Memory of Silence. There was another that was run by the Catholic Church. If you click the Memory of Silence on the slides, you'll get to the archive of the National Police of Guatemala City. That archive is housed by the University of Texas Austin, by the Benson Library that I've mentioned, and you can go and access it there. Um, it has the records of torture and abuse and deaths and disappearances that were orchestrated by the police in it. And it was kind of a miracle that it was found in 2005 that the regime hadn't burned it down. That's something that also provides a basis for trying to bring the perpetrators of torture and human rights violations to justice in Guatemala. There are photographers and artists. If you click here, this will take you to a story about the photography of Daniel Hernandez. He is one that designed a cover, this angel wings man who is in a few different poses there, to illustrate the difficult legacies surrounding all of this. And of course, the largest photo here is showing the exhuming of bodies in mass graves. Now with the DNA technology and other things that we have, the UN and other groups have gone to assist people with trying to find their loved ones so that they can give them a proper burial and finally have closure. It says here, this was just painted on a wall in Guatemala City, justice for the genocide. And there still is a debate in Guatemala, those who believe there was a genocide and those who say there wasn't. In 2013, Efrain Rios Montt was actually convicted of genocide by a Guatemalan court, although that was overturned, and appeals have hit up against the problem that he's now well into his 80s and he has dementia. And so there doesn't look like there's a good chance of having a conviction there. But other kind of more minor members of the military have been convicted. And all of this is to say, there's this ongoing effort to try to bring closure and bring justice to Guatemala for all of these acts that were perpetrated against the Guatemalan people. All right, let's wind it up here. Thank you for listening to this presentation on Guatemalan history. Please let me know what questions you have and we can talk further about these things. Also, I'm going to provide a link to some music by Rebecca Lane, who is a Guatemalan hip-hop artist. She has a couple of songs on her newest album that reflect some of the issues that we've talked about here. So if you understand Spanish and are interested, or even if you don't, give that a listen and see what you think.